hospital waiting room glowed under harsh fluorescent lights, the kind that drained the world of warmth. Chairs lined the walls, most of them empty at this hour, save for one woman who sat hunched over, her coat pulled tightly around her as though it could protect her from the pain within. Her name was Emma. She was only 32, but the weight of her solitude made her look older. It was nearly midnight when she pushed through the sliding glass doors of the emergency entrance. No one walked beside her. No hand steadied her trembling frame. She carried no bag, brought no family member to help explain her symptoms. All she had was herself, and the searing pain in her abdomen that had grown unbearable. The receptionist looked up, startled by her pale, sweat-drenched face. "Can you tell me your name?" she asked quickly. Emma whispered it, her voice hoarse, before nearly collapsing into the nearest chair. Within minutes, a wheelchair was brought, and she was rushed past the triage desk into the cold brightness of the ER. Doctors and nurses gathered, their practiced calm hiding the alarm rising beneath the surface. Emma's vitals were unstable, fever spiking, pulse racing, blood pressure falling. "Septic shock," one doctor murmured, already preparing orders. IV lines were placed, antibiotics pushed, fluids rushed. Her body trembled violently, every breath shallow and fragile. Yet what struck the staff most was not just her condition, but her isolation. On her admissions chart under emergency contact, the box was empty. No family, no partner, no one to call. In a place where cries of loved ones usually echoed through the hallways, Emma's silence was deafening. A nurse named Claire stayed by her side as the team worked. She noticed the way Emma's eyes darted anxiously around the room, not searching for medical equipment, but for a face that wasn't there. "You're safe," Claire whispered, squeezing her hand. Emma tried to nod, but her head fell weakly to the side, exhaustion pulling her under. The room moved in a blur of urgency. Machines beeped, footsteps echoed, commands were barked, but Emma seemed detached from it all, caught between consciousness and oblivion. For a fleeting second, she wondered if this was how her life would end, not in fire or noise, not surrounded by goodbyes, but in sterile silence, with no one to witness her final breath. Doctors stabilized her enough to move her to a private room. The quiet there was suffocating. The monitors beeped rhythmically, but the air was heavy, as though the walls themselves understood the loneliness of the woman lying in bed. Her skin was pale, her lips dry, her breathing labored. If someone had passed by, they might have mistaken her for a figure already fading. And yet, somewhere beneath that fragile exterior, something within her refused to let go. Emma's story began not with triumph, not with miracles, but with the image of a woman stepping into a hospital alone, facing a night that seemed to promise only endings. No one, least of all Emma, could have imagined what awaited her in the days to come. This was the beginning. The moment where despair and silence collided with the possibility of something greater. Emma had always been the kind of woman who carried her burdens quietly. At 32, she lived in a modest apartment on the edge of the city, worked long hours at a bookstore, and rarely drew attention to herself. To most people, she seemed ordinary, just another face in the crowd, polite but reserved, reliable but unremarkable. Yet those who looked closer would see that her life had been anything but easy. She had grown up in a small town, the eldest of 3 children. Her father left when she was 12, leaving her mother to raise the family alone. Responsibility fell heavily on Emma's young shoulders, and from an early age, she learned to be the caretaker, the dependable one. But as the years went on, that role became both her armor and her prison. She became so used to holding others up that she forgot how to ask for help herself. Health had always been her secret battle. In her teens, she developed a series of chronic issues that baffled local doctors: persistent infections, fainting spells, unexplained fevers. Nothing ever seemed to resolve completely. While her peers chased dreams and carefree adventures, Emma learned to pace herself, to conserve energy, to smile through fatigue. Her friends described her as resilient, but resilience born from necessity often leaves invisible scars. By her mid-20s, Emma had lost touch with many of those friends. They married, had children, moved to new cities. She stayed behind, building a quiet life in the bookstore where she worked. She found comfort in the smell of old pages, in the stories of characters braver and bolder than she felt herself to be. Books became her companions, their worlds filling the silence of her small apartment. Romance never came easily. She had tried, once or twice, but her health often pushed others away. Some grew tired of canceled plans, of late-night hospital visits, of the unpredictability that shadowed her life. Others simply couldn't understand her guarded nature, the way she kept her pain tucked away where no one could reach it. Over time, Emma stopped trying. Independence became her shield. If she expected nothing from anyone, she couldn't be disappointed. And yet, despite everything, there was a quiet strength in her. She woke each day, went to work, paid her bills, smiled at customers, and carried herself with dignity. She wasn't bitter. She wasn't hardened. She had learned, painfully, that the world owed her nothing, and so she survived on her own terms. But beneath that strength was an unspoken longing, a desire for connection, for someone to notice the battles she fought in silence. That longing was perhaps why, as she sat alone in the hospital bed that first night, the emptiness felt sharper than the pain in her body. It wasn't just her failing health that threatened to break her. It was the fear that if she slipped away, no one would even notice. The nurses who cared for her in those first days saw only fragments of the woman she truly was. They saw the pale face, the trembling hands, the weakness in her body. They didn't yet know about the years of quiet perseverance, the countless nights she had endured alone, whispering to herself that tomorrow would be better. They didn't know about the girl who once dreamed of becoming a teacher, or the woman who now found solace in books because real life had been too unforgiving. Emma was more than a patient. She was more than a diagnosis. She was the sum of years of survival, of sacrifices unseen, of strength uncelebrated. And though she entered the hospital with nothing but her name on a chart, her story carried depths waiting to be revealed. The world had underestimated her before. They would soon do it again. But Emma's life was about to prove that resilience, even when buried beneath exhaustion and despair, can become the spark of something extraordinary. The first 24 hours were critical. Emma's condition, already fragile when she arrived, deteriorated faster than anyone expected. Her fever spiked dangerously high, her breathing grew shallow, and the monitors that tracked her vitals painted a bleak picture. Nurses moved quickly, adjusting fluids, checking IV lines, wiping sweat from her clammy forehead. The room buzzed with activity, yet for all their efforts, her numbers refused to stabilize. A team of doctors convened outside her door, their hushed voices carrying an unmistakable weight. Words like septic shock, organ failure, and critical state drifted through the air. One physician, a gray-haired man who had seen more than his share of hopeless cases, shook his head with finality. "She came in too late," he muttered. "There's little we can do now but keep her comfortable." Inside the room, Emma drifted in and out of awareness. Sometimes she caught glimpses of faces leaning over her, felt the sting of needles, the rush of cold fluids into her veins. Other times she slipped into a fog so thick she wasn't sure if she was alive or already gone. The line between the two blurred. and the silence inside her own mind became louder than the chaos outside. For Emma, this was the moment when time seemed to stretch and collapse all at once. The walls of the hospital faded, and memories surfaced uninvited. Her mother's tired smile after long shifts, her siblings laughing in a kitchen years ago, the smell of rain on the bookstore steps. Fragments of life, scattered like broken glass, reflected back at her. And with each fragment came the same terrifying question: is this the end? Her body weakened further as infections spread. Machines that were meant to support her became ominous reminders of how close she was to slipping away. A nurse adjusted her oxygen mask, whispering, "Stay with us, Emma," though her voice carried little conviction. Emma wanted to answer, to say she was trying, but no words came. Her lips moved soundlessly, her strength too thin to break through. By the third night, the prognosis was grim. Doctors updated the chart with coal deficiency, poor response to treatment, declining condition, prepare family notification. But when they looked again at her file, the blank space for emergency contact stared back at them. There was no family to call, no loved one to gather for a final goodbye. Emma's solitude, once simply a quiet fact of her life, now became a shadow hovering over her bed. It was in that emptiness that the turning point emerged. Not through science, not through a sudden breakthrough in medicine, but through something unseen. Despite the odds stacked against her, her body showed small, inexplicable signs of resistance. Her blood pressure, though unstable, didn't crash entirely. Her oxygen levels dipped and rose as though she were fighting against the darkness tugging at her. Doctors dismissed it as temporary fluctuations, but the nurses who sat by her bedside at night began to notice a rhythm, a stubbornness in her numbers that refused to give in completely. In her fog, she felt it too. Somewhere beneath the layers of exhaustion and pain, a thread of determination held her tethered. She could not name it, could not explain it, but it pulsed faintly inside her like a whisper. The turning point wasn't loud. It wasn't a dramatic scene that drew attention. It was a quiet defiance, hidden in the faint beat of a heart that should have slowed, in the shallow breaths that continued when they shouldn't have. Emma had no one at her side, no hand holding hers, but deep within, she clung to something unseen. And though no one in the hospital could sense it yet, this fragile persistence was the spark that would change everything. By the fourth day, something unusual began to unfold. Doctors who had written Emma off as a case of inevitable decline now found themselves staring at her chart with furrowed brows. Her blood pressure, though far from normal, had steadied. Her fever, after days of soaring dangerously high, began to break in sudden, unexpected drops. The infection markers in her blood, once rising relentlessly, showed hints of retreat. None of it made sense. She shouldn't be responding like this, one physician admitted during morning rounds, flipping through her test results again, as though the numbers might change if he looked hard enough. With the severity of her sepsis, this kind of recovery is rare. His tone was cautious, unwilling to use the word miracle, yet unable to deny what he saw. The nurses noticed it too, but in subtler ways. Emma's breathing grew steadier at night. Her restless tossing faded into deeper, more peaceful sleep. The once constant alarms from her monitors grew less frequent, replaced by a steady rhythm that carried a strange comfort. Some staff shrugged it off as coincidence, the natural ebb and flow of critical illness. Others began whispering about the patient in room 9, whose survival defied explanation. Emma herself was only dimly aware of the changes. Drifting between sleep and wakefulness, she felt moments of clarity breaking through the fog. Once, she opened her eyes to see the nurse Claire adjusting her IV line. Her lips trembled, and in a hoarse voice she managed, "Thank you." The nurse froze, startled by the sound of words she hadn't expected from someone so close to collapse. Claire smiled softly, squeezing her hand. "You're stronger than you know," she said. But the real mystery lay deeper than vitals and test results. Emma began to sense something she couldn't explain, an invisible presence, as though she were not as alone as the world believed. In the stillness of her room, she felt warmth near her chest, a reassurance that pulsed quietly beneath the fear. It was not a vision, not a dream, but a sensation that seemed to whisper, "Hold on." When doctors entered with their skeptical eyes and clinical voices, they saw only data. They could not see what Emma felt, the subtle strength coursing through her veins, steadying her against the darkness. And though she lacked the strength to explain it, Emma knew something extraordinary was happening. Nurses who lingered at her bedside began to notice details that puzzled them. When Emma was spoken to, her eyelids fluttered more often, as though she understood. When someone held her hand, her grip, faint as it was, seemed deliberate. These were not the reflexes of a body shutting down. These were signs of life, stubborn and intentional. Yet the greatest mystery was not medical, it was human. How could a woman who entered the hospital utterly alone radiate such resilience? How could someone with no one waiting in the halls, no family on call, fight harder than patients surrounded by loved ones? Her solitude should have broken her. Instead, it seemed to sharpen her will. By the end of the week, even the most skeptical voices had quieted. Emma was no longer the hopeless case, she was the question mark. Doctors still warned of dangers ahead, reminding staff that recovery from sepsis was unpredictable, often cruel. But privately, they admitted what none dared say aloud. She was surviving against all odds. In the silence of her room, Emma stirred slightly, her lips forming faint words no one could fully catch. Claire leaned closer, straining to hear, and though the sound was barely audible, it carried a clarity that sent shivers down the nurse's spine. "I'm not alone." The hospital nights stretched endlessly, each hour marked by the steady rhythm of machines. Nurses made their quiet rounds, adjusting IV lines, checking vitals, whispering updates to the chart. For Emma, those hours were a blur of drifting consciousness, shadows of memory mixing with the sharp sting of pain. She had been silent for days, her words trapped somewhere between her mind and her failing body. No one expected her voice to return. But on the third night of her second week, something shifted. Claire, the nurse who had stayed faithfully by her side, was tidying the room, humming softly as she checked the monitors. Emma's breathing, though shallow, had grown more even. Claire adjusted the blanket, then reached for Emma's hand as she always did. "You're not alone," she whispered, though she doubted Emma could hear. Then it happened. A faint sound, barely louder than a breath, broke the silence. Claire froze, her eyes snapping to Emma's lips. They moved again, trembled, and then shaped words that should not have been possible. "I'm not alone anymore." The nurse gasped, leaning closer. "Emma, can you say that again?" With immense effort, Emma's eyes fluttered open. They were heavy, glassy, but alive. And then, with a fragile clarity that sent chills down Claire's spine, she whispered, "Someone's here with me." The words echoed through the sterile room like thunder. Claire's heart raced. She pressed the call button, summoning other staff. Within moments, doctors and nurses crowded around the bed, their disbelief painted clearly on their faces. Emma, once considered a silent, hopeless case, had spoken. "Emma, can you hear me?" a doctor asked urgently. Her lips cracked into the faintest smile. "I hear. I'm not alone." The staff exchanged stunned glances. For days they had monitored her vitals, puzzled by her resilience, whispering about the mystery patient in room 9. But this was undeniable proof that she was not only fighting, but aware, present, holding on to something none of them could see. Claire's hands trembled as she brushed a strand of hair from Emma's damp forehead. She said softly, tears welling in her eyes, "You're safe, Emma. We're here. I'm here." But Emma shook her head faintly. "Not just you," she whispered. "Someone else with me." No one knew what she meant. The doctors chalked it up to delirium, a side effect of fever and medication. Yet the conviction in her eyes was too sharp, too lucid to dismiss. It was as though Emma had tapped into something invisible. Something beyond medicine, beyond reason. For the first time since her admission, the staff felt the shift. Hope, cautious and fragile, entered the room. The patient who had walked into the hospital alone had found a voice. And in that voice was the beginning of something no one could fully explain. As the team left the room, still whispering about what they had witnessed, Claire lingered. She squeezed Emma's hand again, unable to shake the feeling that the woman lying in bed was not just surviving, but being carried by something greater. Emma closed her eyes once more, her lips forming one last word before sleep claimed her. "Miracle!" And with that single whisper, the impossible no longer seemed so far away. For a brief moment, the hospital staff allowed themselves to hope. Emma had spoken, her words fragile, yet undeniable. Nurses exchanged cautious smiles, and even the doctors, usually anchored in cold realism, admitted that her progress was remarkable. In the sterile halls of the ICU, where miracles were rarely spoken of, her whisper of miracle still echoed. But in hospitals, hope often walks hand in hand with heartbreak. On the morning of her 12th day, the monitors began to scream. Alarms pierced the air as Emma's blood pressure plummeted and her heart rate spiked erratically. Nurses rushed into the room, pulling carts, shouting numbers. IV bags were replaced, oxygen increased, medications pushed in frantic succession. The fragile stability Emma had fought for seemed to collapse in a matter of minutes. "Septic flare," one doctor barked, scanning her chart. "We knew this could happen." His voice carried the weight of inevitability, but Claire, standing at Emma's side, refused to accept it. She held Emma's trembling hand, whispering fiercely, "Stay with us. You've come too far." Emma's body convulsed under the strain, her fragile frame drenched in sweat. The color drained from her skin, leaving her ghostly pale. For those terrifying hours, the hospital room once again felt like a battleground between life and death. Staff moved in practiced urgency, but doubt lingered in every face. They had seen patients rally only to fall back into the abyss. Was Emma destined to become another cruel reminder of hope extinguished too soon? In her half-conscious haze, Emma felt the darkness pulling at her again. The warmth she had sensed before flickered, dimming beneath the weight of pain and exhaustion. Her mind filled with the echo of the doctor's words. Too late, too sick, no chance. She wanted to surrender, to stop fighting. But then, like a distant echo carried through storm winds, she felt it, the presence she had spoken of, steady, unwavering. A faint memory surfaced, her mother's voice reading to her as a child, telling her that even in the darkest nights, light always returns. Emma clung to that memory, her lips parting with a breathless murmur no one could quite hear. Claire leaned closer, straining to catch the words. "Not yet." The nurse's heart clenched. She turned to the team, her voice sharp and determined. "She's still fighting. Don't give up on her." Through relentless intervention, Emma was eventually stabilized, though barely. Her vitals climbed back to a fragile equilibrium, like a tightrope stretched over a canyon. The doctors warned of further complications, cautioning that recovery was still far from certain. "This is a critical setback," one said, shaking his head. If she crashes again, there may not be a way back. That night, after the chaos had quieted, Claire remained in the room. The monitors hummed softly now, the earlier storm giving way to uneasy calm. She sat beside Emma, opening a children's book she had found on the hospital's volunteer cart. In a gentle voice, she read aloud, filling the sterile silence with words meant to comfort. At some point, she reached for a small device on the table, a recording sent from the hospital's volunteer network, featuring children's voices reading letters of encouragement to patients. She played it softly near Emma's ear. Among the laughter and hopeful words, Emma stirred faintly, her lips twitching as though she heard them in her dreams. Claire placed her hand back on Emma's, whispering, "You are not alone. You never were, and I won't let you be." The hospital mornings always began the same way. The slow shuffle of nurses changing shifts, the clatter of carts in the hallway, the muted voices of doctors making their rounds. For Emma, these mornings had blurred into indistinguishable fragments of half-dreams and shallow breaths. But on this particular morning, something extraordinary was about to break the monotony. The sun had just begun to rise, its pale light cutting through the blinds of room 9. Golden rays spilled across the sterile floor, softening the edges of the machines that had become her lifeline. Claire was there, as she always was, adjusting Emma's IV line with her steady, practiced hands. She had grown used to Emma's stillness, to the fragile rhythm of her survival. But when she looked down that morning, she froze. Emma's eyelids flickered. At first, Claire thought it was another involuntary twitch, the kind she had seen before. But then, slowly, with visible effort, Emma's eyes opened. They were clouded, unfocused, but unmistakably alive. Claire's breath caught in her throat. "Emma? Can you hear me?" For a long moment, silence hung heavy in the room. Then Emma's gaze shifted, locking onto Claire's face. Her lips parted, dry and cracked, but determined. "Where am I?" she whispered. Tears sprang to Claire's eyes. She pressed the call button, her voice trembling as she called into the hall. "She's awake! She's talking!" Within moments, the room flooded with staff. Doctors leaned in, stethoscopes dangling, eyes wide with disbelief. One of them leaned closer. "Emma, it's Dr. Patel. You're in the hospital. You've been very sick. Do you understand me?" Emma's lips curved into the faintest smile, fragile yet clear. "I understand," she said, her voice raspy but steady. "It's not my time." The room erupted into a stunned hush. For weeks, Emma had been the patient no one expected to survive. She had hovered between life and death, silent, motionless, a name on a chart more than a person in a bed. And now, here she was, awake, speaking, declaring her will to live with a clarity that defied every prediction. Claire pressed her hand over her mouth, overcome by the moment. She had held Emma's hand through long nights of uncertainty, whispered words into silence, and fought against the despair that threatened to swallow them both. And now, hearing Emma's voice, it felt like witnessing a sunrise after endless night. Emma turned her head slightly, eyes glistening with tears she lacked the strength to shed. "I thought I was alone, but I wasn't." The staff exchanged puzzled glances. One doctor muttered about hallucinations caused by medication, but even he couldn't mask his awe in his voice. Whatever the explanation, Emma's awakening was beyond what science could measure. It was not just recovery, it was rebirth. Claire leaned closer, brushing Emma's hair gently from her damp forehead. "You're here," she said softly, her voice breaking. "You made it through." Emma's weak smile grew a little stronger. "I still have more to do." Those words lingered in the air long after the doctors finished their assessments and left the room. Nurses whispered about her down the hall, their disbelief giving way to wonder. The patient in room 9 was no longer just a medical case. She had become a living reminder that sometimes, against all odds, life refuses to let go. And in that quiet, miraculous morning light, Emma's journey shifted forever. The impossible had just become reality. Survival was only the first battle. Once the shock of Emma's awakening faded, reality set in. Her body was weak, ravaged by infection, and every muscle had forgotten its strength. What came next would not be a single moment of triumph, but a long, grueling confrontation with herself, her pain, her fear, and her willpower. Physical therapy began days after she woke. Though Emma felt far from ready, the first session was humiliating. A therapist named Mark helped her sit on the edge of the bed, supporting her trembling back with firm hands. "Let's try to stand," he said gently. Emma shook her head, her body trembling with the effort of simply holding herself upright. Her legs felt like lead. Her chest burned with every breath. Yet Mark encouraged her. "One step at a time. We'll face this together." With Claire watching from the corner, Emma gritted her teeth and tried. Her feet touched the floor, but the weight of her own body was unbearable. After mere seconds, she collapsed back onto the mattress, gasping. Hot tears spilled down her cheeks. "I can't," she whispered. But Claire knelt beside her, taking her hand. "You already did," she said softly. "You tried. That's the first victory." The days blurred into a cycle of struggle and exhaustion. Each morning brought new challenges, learning to lift a cup of water, practicing to speak without her voice breaking, taking 2 shaky steps with the help of a walker. Every action felt monumental, yet impossibly small compared to the life she once had. The frustration gnawed at her. She had survived against impossible odds, yet here she was, unable to walk across a room. Emotionally, the weight was heavier still. In the quiet of the night, Emma wrestled with questions she couldn't silence. Why me? Why was I spared? What if I can't rebuild the life I lost? Loneliness lingered, sharper now that she was conscious enough to feel it fully. She still had no family to call, no one waiting outside her room. Recovery was supposed to be celebrated, but Emma often felt like she was fighting it all alone. The staff, however, refused to let her drown in despair. Claire became her anchor, showing up with small comforts, a favorite book from the hospital library, a warm blanket, whispered encouragement during the darkest hours. Mark pushed her through therapy, celebrating even the smallest progress as though it were a marathon completed. Slowly, Emma began to see herself not as a burden, but as a fighter, each small step proof of her resilience. The breakthrough came one afternoon when she managed, after countless failed attempts, to stand for nearly a full minute without collapsing. The entire therapy team clapped, their cheers echoing down the hallway. Emma, breathless and trembling, allowed herself the first true smile since arriving at the hospital. It wasn't the end of her struggle, but it was proof she could face it. Still, the confrontation with her own fragility never truly left. Each victory carried the shadow of fear that she could relapse, that the infection might return, that the miracle she had been given could be taken away in an instant. But even in that fear, Emma discovered a new kind of courage. Not the absence of doubt, but the choice to keep moving forward despite it. The confrontation was not glamorous, it was not easy, but in the crucible of that struggle, Emma was being reshaped, not into the woman she once was, but into someone stronger, someone who understood the depth of survival in a way only those who had walked through fire could know. And though she still faced countless battles ahead, one truth had become clear. Emma was no longer just surviving. The day Emma walked again without assistance, the hospital staff erupted into quiet celebration. It wasn't a graceful walk. Her legs shook, her body leaned heavily on the walker, and every step seemed to drain her strength. But she moved forward, one step after another, through the hallway that had once felt like a prison. For Emma, those trembling strides marked not just physical progress, but a declaration. She was reclaiming her life. Recovery didn't happen overnight. Weeks passed, each one filled with therapy sessions, checkups, and endless tests. But each week also brought new victories. She learned to hold a spoon steadily again. She managed to climb 2 stairs without collapsing. She sat in the hospital's courtyard one afternoon, the winter sun warming her face, and felt, for the first time in years, a genuine sense of peace. The nurses became her family. They cheered her on, teased her gently, and filled her room with warmth that had long been missing in her life. Claire, especially, became more than just a caregiver. She became her anchor, her confidant, the person who reminded her daily that she mattered. What had begun as duty had blossomed into genuine affection, a bond that no chart or medical file could capture. When the doctors finally told her she could be discharged, Emma was stunned. She had entered the hospital with death hovering close, with no one to call and no hope of a future. Now she was leaving, fragile still, but alive, stronger, and forever changed. On the morning of her release, the staff gathered near the doors, clapping softly as she walked out with slow but determined steps. The hallway that once echoed with the frantic rush of her emergency arrival now carried the steady rhythm of her new beginning. Emma paused at the threshold, tears filling her eyes, and she looked back at the faces of those who had carried her through the impossible and whispered, "Thank you for everything." Outside, the world felt different. The air was crisper, the sky brighter, as though life itself had been painted in sharper colors. She no longer carried the heavy cloak of solitude that had weighed her down when she first entered. Though she had no family waiting, she was not alone. She had discovered connection in the most unlikely place, in the compassion of strangers who became her lifeline. As she stepped into the sunlight, Emma realized that her miracle was not only survival, it was transformation. She had entered the hospital broken, isolated, convinced that life had little left to offer her. Now she left with a renewed spirit, with proof that even in the darkest places, light can break through. The doors closed behind her with a soft hiss, but for Emma, they symbolized something far greater, the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. The hospital had been her battleground, her crucible, her place of unexpected rebirth. Now the world awaited her, full of uncertainties, but also brimming with possibilities she no longer feared. Her story was no longer of survival alone. It was a story of courage, of connection, and of the quiet miracle that can happen when hope refuses to die. Emma's first days outside the hospital felt like stepping into a world she had forgotten. The simplest things, a breeze through her hair, the hum of city traffic, the laughter of children in a nearby park, felt overwhelming. She had left those sliding glass doors as a different woman, carrying not just the scars of illness, but the quiet weight of a miracle that no one, not even she, could fully explain. When people asked about her story, Emma often hesitated. How could she put into words what had happened in room 9? How could she explain the presence she felt when no one else was there? the unshakable sense that something or someone had refused to let her go. To most, she simply said, "I came here alone, but I didn't leave that way." Claire, who visited her during those early weeks of recovery, pressed her gently one afternoon. They sat together in Emma's small apartment, a cup of tea warming Emma's hands. "You said once that you weren't alone," Claire reminded her. "What did you mean?" Emma looked out the window, her gaze distant. "It's hard to explain," she said softly. "There were moments when I should have slipped away. I could feel it, the darkness pressing in. But every time, something pulled me back. Not medicine, not machines, something stronger." Claire tilted her head, her eyes filled with quiet curiosity. "Do you think it was faith? A memory? Maybe your own willpower?" Emma smiled faintly. "Maybe all of that. Or maybe something we're not meant to understand." She paused, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "What I know is this. I didn't walk out of that hospital the same person who walked in. I left with proof that life can change in ways we don't expect. Proof that miracles, they're real." Her words carried a gravity that lingered in the air. For Claire, who had witnessed Emma's journey from the edge of death to this fragile new beginning, the statement felt undeniable. She had seen charts that defied logic, heard whispers that couldn't be explained, felt the electric shift in the room when Emma first spoke. It was more than recovery, it was transformation. Emma leaned back, her eyes glistening. "But sometimes I wonder," she added quietly, "if I was given this second chance, maybe it's not just for me. Maybe it's for someone else. Maybe the reason I survived hasn't even happened yet." Claire reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "Then whatever it is, you'll be ready." Emma nodded, though in her heart she knew the story was far from finished. Her survival was not the ending, it was the beginning of something larger, something waiting just beyond the horizon. As the evening sun cast long shadows across the room, Emma whispered to herself words she had once spoken in the quiet of the hospital. "It's not my time. I have more to do." And with that, her story ended not with finality, but with a question that hung in the air for anyone who heard it. How many miracles are waiting, quietly, just beyond the edge of despair?